"Gemma, you've been at this for a while now. Mrs. Monroe won't be pleased with us," said Rowan, smiling at his daughter who was fussing in front of the mirror. At just 5 years old, she carried herself with an unusual level of seriousness, which brought a constant smile to not just her father's face, but also to her caregivers. Mrs. Monroe, her kindergarten teacher, would say that in all her years of experience, she had never seen such a unique child. Sometimes Rowan would come home tired, desiring some peace and quiet, but Gemma would immediately sit down next to him and ask a question that she'd been contemplating for a while. "Dad, why do we dream?" she asked one day as soon as Rowan settled on the couch. He smiled, sat her on his lap, and replied, "That's an excellent question, my little smarty. We dream because our brain never stops, even when we're sleeping, and it creates small stories and pictures that we see in our dreams." But Gemma wasn't satisfied. "But why do we have different dreams? I dreamt about a princess, and Johnny from kindergarten said he saw himself on a spaceship." Each person is unique, and we all have different thoughts and desires. Also, our brains show us things we learned during the day. That's why we have different dreams. But what do brains do when we're awake and not dreaming? And so it continued, until Rowan completely forgot that he'd wanted to lie down with his eyes closed in complete silence just a few minutes ago. Zendaya, Rowan's wife and Gemma's mother, sometimes said, "You know, dear, our daughter frightens me at times. Her reasoning is way beyond that of a 5-year-old, and her questions sometimes leave me at a loss." Rowan would just chuckle. "Honey, but this is a good thing. Look at her, she's only 5 and she's already won an award for creativity as if she's in school." It was true. Rowan and Zendaya were very proud of their little girl and always paid attention to her wishes and opinions. In general, people around them, their friends, never ceased to admire Rowan's family, holding them up as an example to all. It seemed as if nothing could break their strong bonds. However, as it usually happens, even in seemingly perfect lives, unexpected challenges and problems arise. Recently, his beloved wife Zendaya had been acting strangely over the past few weeks. She seemed scared, avoiding eye contact, as if she was hiding something from him. When asked if everything was okay, she would respond in a way that quickly changed the subject. No, it couldn't be that she wasn't telling him something, whether it was a small mishap or a big problem. They had always had a relationship based on trust. Rowan was lost in thought and almost drove past the kindergarten. To figure out what was bothering him about his wife, his mind flashed back to the early days. Rowan and Zendaya met back in university. They were both rushing to their first lecture and accidentally got stuck in one of the old, not very reliable elevators. Zendaya was pressing the emergency buttons with hope, but nothing was happening. The young people had to call their friends to notify the authorities. All they could do now was wait for help to arrive. It was unclear how long it would take, but they didn't get disheartened and started to joke around. Rowan picked up an improvised microphone and, with a presenter's voice, began, "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a very special episode of our TV show, where we're stuck in an elevator and have the most fascinating stories for you." Playing the role of a host, Rowan asked Zendaya, "How do you feel being here?" Zendaya, who was on the verge of a claustrophobia-induced panic attack, broke into laughter. It was clear that Rowan's resourcefulness had somewhat relaxed her. Sensing she was still panicked, Rowan himself answered the question in a feminine voice. "Oh, it's quite a romantic place for a date, but I'd prefer a rooftop restaurant." They laughed at the joke and continued to chat. Half an hour flew by like a couple of minutes. Finally, the elevators started moving. Rowan and Zendaya were free, and with a smile they realized that this incident had led to a memorable encounter. From that day on, they became good friends and always reminisced about this amusing story. However, soon, Rowan began to see more than just a friend in the beautiful girl. He admired her beauty, was in awe of her actions, and felt happy to be around her. It took him a while to confess his feelings, fearing that if she didn't reciprocate, he might lose their friendship. But it couldn't continue like this. One day, Rowan decided to take the leap. He asked Zendaya for a walk. She was surprised to see him holding a huge bouquet, but what impressed her even more were his words about being in love with her for quite a while. That day, Rowan learned that she had been harboring the same feelings for him. They laughed and agreed from that day to keep no secrets from each other. They dated for a long time and got married right after graduating. They planned everything ahead and had Gemma. Next on their plans was to open a small organic food store. They were saving money, and by the next year they were supposed to start making their dream a reality. Rowan loved Zendaya, adored his daughter, and would do anything for them. At the same time, he knew Zendaya would do the same. That's why her recent behaviour alarmed and saddened him. Sometimes a thought creeped in that Zendaya might have another man, but he instantly dismissed such thoughts. One thing he was really scared of was to go through what his parents had gone. It was too painful for him to even contemplate the past. Rowan didn't want history to repeat itself, didn't want to relive the horrors of his parents' relationship. His family, the one he was brought up in, the one everyone around him considered perfect, was anything but that in reality. He vividly remembered that day as if it was yesterday. He had come home early from school because he was suffering from a throbbing headache, and the teacher had allowed him to leave. Upon entering his house, he immediately heard the loud voices of his parents. Nervously, he walked into the living room and arrived just in time to witness his father hit his mother. She was knocked back onto the couch from the force of the blow, letting out a soft groan of pain. His father, with an ominous look on his face, moved toward her. Rowan, without thinking, threw himself in between them. "Leave Mom alone," was all the young boy could shout, holding back the tears that were threatening to spill out. The idea of such violence was so foreign to him, he simply couldn't comprehend it. His father paused in front of him, fists clenched. "She's to blame for everything. You'll understand this soon enough." But Rowan didn't flinch. He stood there between his mother and father, meeting his father's gaze unblinkingly. His father just waved him off and walked away, leaving his mother in tears. She cried, clutching Rowan close to her, muttering incomprehensible words. Occasionally through her sobs, Rowan caught phrases like, "I'm sorry," and "You'll understand someday." Indeed, he did understand what his mother meant, but only years later. What followed was a painful divorce. His father, Winston Douglas, had a lot of connections. In court, he managed to gain custody of Rowan. Furthermore, his father's lawyers painted his mother, Linda, in such a negative light that the court barred her from coming near her son. In court, his mother wept, gripping his hands tightly, but Rowan just stood silently, not moving and not meeting her gaze. Winston told him that their mother had betrayed them, that she had another man, and that she had chosen him over them. The realization was painful, deeply hurtful, and bitter. As Rowan grew older, he started to understand that things were not as simple as he had thought. His father was a cruel man. When he was small, he saw but did not attribute importance to many things. Frequently, his mother had bruises and cuts, which she would explain to him as accidents due to her clumsiness. Rowan couldn't recall a time when his mother openly voiced her opinions or challenged his father. In recent times, she hardly ever smiled except when she was alone with him. One day, while rummaging through old stuff in the storeroom, he came across a thin notebook. It revealed many events and circumstances of his mother's life. The moments she couldn't bear to keep inside were poured out in this written confession. From what he read, Rowan deduced the following. Linda, his mother, had endured her husband's harsh treatment with fortitude, always striving to be a good wife. From the beginning, she felt indebted to him. Early in their married life, Linda had noticed Winston's despotic traits. He never tolerated objections, controlled everything in the house, forbade her from working, restricted her social interactions, and could lose his temper for any reason. The primary cause for his anger was jealousy. He was suspicious of every man around his wife. Linda always believed that if he was jealous, it meant he loved her. Then Rowan was born. His young mother transferred all her love and care to him. It all happened when she ended up in the hospital following yet another scandal stirred by her husband. Understandably, she didn't share the real reason behind it with anyone. Due to complications, she had to stay in the hospital for around 10 days. During this time, she was cared for by a young doctor who turned out to be sensitive, kind, and responsive. He showed interest and care for her, setting her apart from the rest of the patients. And so it happened. After a long period of neglect, lack of tender attention and care, she became fond of this man. Initially, it was just innocent interaction. The doctor periodically called her, citing the need to monitor his patient's conditions. He gave professional advice, asked her to take care of herself. Then, during one of the follow-up visits, the doctor invited Linda for a coffee. Gradually, everything evolved into a romantic relationship. The man urged her to leave her husband and come to him as soon as possible. He even offered to confront her husband together. However, Linda insisted on handling the situation herself. She didn't want to deceive Winston but was fearful of his reaction. She also worried that her young son wouldn't understand. Nonetheless, she finally decided to confess. However, she could never have imagined that her husband would find out about everything much earlier. And so, the inevitable happened. Rowan now clearly understood how difficult it was for his mother in their home. He missed her, and often asked his father about her whereabouts, only to be met with shouts. He resolved that once he became independent, he would definitely find her. But just as he turned 16, his father gave him a letter. It revealed that his mother was no more. Her sister had asked for Rowan to be brought to the funeral because Linda missed him and kept repeating his name on her deathbed. However, the letter had been sent 2 weeks earlier. At first, Rowan thought it was due to a postal delay, but then realised his father had deliberately held the letter back, making it pointless to attend. Rowan never forgave his father for this act. As soon as he turned 18, he left his mother's diary in front of his father and hastily left the family home. After that, he didn't see him, only occasionally calling to check if he was okay, but their conversations never extended beyond formal inquiries. Neither man found the right words for each other, and their strained interaction always ended there. "Dad, didn't you forget we're heading to the daycare?" Rowan snapped back to reality and stepped on the brakes. "Sorry, Gemma. I was lost in thought." Gemma raised her index finger. "Dad, you can't zone out behind the wheel, especially when there are kids in the car." He smiled. "Yes, I know, sweetheart. I promise it won't happen again." Gemma, satisfied with the response, got out of the car. "Mrs. Monroe," Rowan signalled to the caregiver, who, nudging Gemma towards the door, approached him. Gemma was complaining today about Daniel picking on the girls, and it seems she's planning to set things right. "Could you please keep an eye on her?" Rowan bid her goodbye and headed to work. He had a tough day ahead, and in the evening, Zendaya was picking up Gemma. After breakfast, Gemma, seeing Daniel, decided to settle their scores. Daniel was ready for the confrontation, and it escalated into a serious fight. By the time Mrs. Monroe, the caretaker, could intervene and separate the two, the little girl had received a scrape on her nose. The injury was minor, but it upset her. "Let's go to our nurse, she can have a look," suggested Mrs. Monroe. Gemma agreed. She didn't want to look unattractive. Peyton, the nurse, gave her a kind smile. She was only 3 days into this job at the daycare, but she was absolutely loving it. The work, the staff, and the children. "What's your name?" Peyton asked, crouching slightly to meet the little girl's gaze. "Gemma," the girl answered, her wide eyes studying the young nurse with curiosity. "And I know you," she added, her voice carrying a hint of confidence. Peyton smiled, amused but puzzled. "Oh, really? From where?" "Your picture's in my dad's wallet," Gemma replied, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. At that, Mrs. Monroe, standing nearby, raised a sharply arched eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. Peyton blinked, feeling a flush creep into her cheeks. She didn't even have a boyfriend, so she couldn't imagine how her photo might have ended up in anyone's wallet, let alone a stranger's. "Gemma, that can't be right," Mrs. Munro interjected, her tone firm but laced with scepticism. "It's true. I've seen it there for a long time," Gemma insisted, her small voice unwavering. Peyton's confusion deepened, and she shot an uneasy glance at Mrs. Munro, hoping the older woman might offer some explanation. But instead, Mrs. Munro's eyes narrowed slightly, her lips pressed into a tight line. The shift in her expression made Peyton uncomfortable, as if she was suddenly being judged. Mrs. Munro, a staunch believer in family values and loyalty, seemed to draw her own conclusion, that Peyton might be involved with Rowan. An awkward silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken thoughts, until Mrs. Munro abruptly turned away, murmuring something about finishing up the day's tasks. Peyton stood there, her mind racing, feeling a strange weight settling on her chest. Later that evening, as Zendaya arrived to pick up her daughter, she was greeted by the daycare teacher, who mentioned a small incident during the day. But before Zendaya could ask for details, Gemma tugged at her arm. "Mum, Mrs. Munro didn't tell you everything," Gemma said, her face serious. Zendaya looked down at her daughter, a smile touching her lips. "Oh? And what might that be?" she asked, amused by Gemma's solemn tone. "We have a new nurse, and her picture is in Dad's wallet," Gemma announced, her voice carrying the weight of something important. Zendaya froze mid-motion, her hand clutching her bag. Surely she had misheard. "What?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Are you sure, Gemma? That doesn't make any sense." "It's true, Mom. Haven't you seen it?" Gemma said matter-of-factly, pointing out the window toward the young nurse who was just leaving the daycare. "Look, there she is." Zendaya's gaze followed her daughter's finger, and there, across the street, she saw Peyton, tall, graceful, and undeniably beautiful, heading for the bus stop. A knot formed in Zendaya's stomach as a flood of thoughts began to swirl in her mind, dark and unsettling. She had been anxious lately, unsure how to share the important news she'd been withholding from Rowan. But now, as she stared at the young woman disappearing into the distance, that conversation seemed unnecessary. She suddenly felt like everything was crashing down, and the unspoken truth lingered, heavy and unrelenting. Zendaya had been gathering her courage for days, steeling herself for the moment when she would finally tell Rowan the news. She was pregnant. But despite Rowan's enthusiastic descriptions of their future life together, the one they had meticulously planned, Zendaya found herself growing more distant from that vision. The truth was, she wanted this baby, desperately, but she feared that it might only be wanted by her. The thought weighed on her heavily, like a secret she didn't want to carry alone but felt she had no choice. As they walked home from the daycare, the silence between Zendaya and Gemma was thick, almost tangible. Gemma, perceptive as ever, had sensed the shift in her mother's mood, but wisely kept quiet, her little mind whirring with questions. Yet, instinct told her now wasn't the time to ask. So they made their way home in silence, the only sound their footsteps on the pavement. Later that night, Rowan came home late from work, his clothes smelling faintly of sweat and sawdust, his usual aura of confidence clouded by exhaustion. Oddly, Zendaya didn't greet him. It was the first time this had ever happened. Even when he returned in the middle of the night, Zendaya, a light sleeper, would always stir, rise, and meet him with a warm hug or a soft kiss. But this time, nothing. Only silence. Rowan stood there for a moment, trying to read the stillness of the house. It was as if something invisible hung between them, something that needed to be addressed. His head buzzed with wild thoughts, and his heart felt unbearably heavy. He sighed, then quietly slipped into bed, careful not to wake Zendaya, though he knew she wasn't asleep. She lay there, her breathing too controlled, too even, as if she were pretending to sleep. He considered saying something but then decided against it. If Zendaya wasn't ready to talk, he would respect that. They could always talk in the morning. They always figured things out together. Whatever this was, it could wait a few more hours. Rowan closed his eyes, though sleep didn't come easily. When morning arrived, Rowan woke to the familiar sounds of commotion from the kitchen, Gemma's disgruntled voice carrying through the hallway. He jolted upright. Blast! He had almost overslept. Rubbing the sleep from his eyes, he stumbled into the kitchen to find Gemma standing in front of the mirror, frowning at her reflection, while Zendaya busied herself with breakfast preparations. "Sweetheart," Rowan said, settling down beside his daughter, "what happened to your face? Did you end up fighting with Daniel after all?" Gemma turned, her small fingers gingerly touching the scratch on her nose. "Yeah, but now he'll think twice before picking on anyone," she said with a sigh. "Dad, how long is this scratch going to stay on my nose?" Rowan chuckled softly, his heart swelling with affection. He leaned down and planted a soft kiss on her nose. "Well, now it'll heal much faster," he said with a wink, before glancing up at Zendaya. "Right, dear." The tension in the room immediately shifted. Zendaya's back stiffened, and she turned toward him with a look that made Rowan's heart sink. "Rowan," she said, her voice unnervingly steady, "we need to talk." Rowan's smile faltered. He had been expecting this, but hearing the words still sent a cold ripple down his spine. "I was about to suggest that," he replied, forcing a casual tone, though the doubt had already begun creeping in. The knot in his stomach tightened as he waited for what was coming next. Zendaya gave him a long look, then abruptly got up, ran out into the hallway, and returned with a clear file. "Here, I've been trying to figure out how to tell you this," Zendaya began, her voice trembling as she struggled to find the right words. "Where to start? I was scared of how you'd react. Anyway, I'm pregnant." For a brief moment, Rowan's face lit up with joy. He had always wanted to grow their family, and this was wonderful news. But that smile quickly faded as he caught the serious expression on his wife's face, sensing there was more beneath the surface. "I'm not planning on terminating the pregnancy," Zendaya continued, her tone firm. "Yes, we didn't plan for this. But that's not what matters now." She paused, taking a deep breath before delivering the blow. "I know about you and your nurse." Rowan's eyes widened in disbelief, his mind racing to process what she had just said. "What? I don't understand. Repeat that. What nurse?" "Oh, don't play dumb, Rowan," Zendaya snapped, her voice dripping with bitterness. "I've always trusted you. I thought you would never betray me, but now I feel like a complete fool." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears as she continued. "How could you? As if it's not bad enough that you're cheating on me with some nurse from Gemma's daycare, but our daughter said you even have her picture in your wallet." Rowan blinked, taken aback by the accusation. He was utterly confused. "What nurse?" he echoed, his voice low. Zendaya threw her hands up in frustration, pacing the room. "I've seen her. Young, beautiful, at least 10 years younger than you. Of course, I guess I'm just not attractive anymore." Her voice broke slightly and Rowan could see how hurt she was, her shoulders trembling with emotion. Rowan closed his eyes and rubbed his temples, feeling an intense headache forming. The joy of learning he was going to be a father again had been completely overshadowed by this wild accusation. He felt like he was standing on shifting ground. "What on earth are you talking about?" he said through gritted teeth. "This nurse, I've never even seen her. Are you out of your mind? Have I ever given you a reason to doubt me?" "Gemma said you have her photo in your wallet," Zendaya shot back, her voice rising. Rowan's patience snapped. Without another word, he stormed out of the room. Moments later, he returned with his wallet in hand, thrusting it towards Zendaya. "Here, look for yourself," he said, flipping open the wallet with force. "Credit cards, documents, money, and our family photo." He pulled out a slightly worn picture of the two of them, taken years ago. Then he slid out another one from behind it, an older, much smaller photo. "This," he said, his voice softer now, "is a picture of my mom. The only photos I've ever kept in this wallet are of you, Gemma, and her." The room fell silent. The anger in Zendaya's face wavered, her gaze shifting between the pictures and her husband's eyes, searching for the truth. A flicker of doubt crossed her face, and in that moment, the tension between them shifted. Suddenly, they both spoke at once, their voices rising in unison. "Gemma, could you come here?" Their daughter appeared at the kitchen doorway, her face pale and unsure. She could sense something was wrong, something much more serious than the usual disagreements her parents had. She stared at them with wide, scared eyes. She had never seen them this upset. "Gemma, what photo were you talking about?" Rowan asked gently, still baffled by the situation. The little girl pointed to the picture her father held in his trembling hands. "This one. It's our nurse." Rowan felt his breath catch. How could that be? This photo was of his mother, long deceased, and Gemma's nurse was far too young to have any connection. At least that's what he thought. Within minutes, Rowan and Zendaya were dressed, barely giving each other time to process the shock. They hurried out the door, buckling Gemma into her seat, as Rowan sped toward the nursery school. His mind raced, filled with disbelief and fragments of impossible thoughts. How could his mother's photo be linked to this young woman? At the daycare, Zendaya took Gemma to her group while Rowan marched straight to the medical section, his heart pounding. Peyton, who had been tidying up some supplies, looked up, startled as Rowan stormed in, still catching his breath. "Hello, can I help you?" she asked, her eyes wide with surprise. Rowan's face was flushed, not just from the run, but from the emotional whirlwind he was caught in. "Apparently I need your help," he said, his voice strained. "I'm Gemma's father." Peyton stiffened, instantly recalling yesterday's conversation with the little girl. A sense of unease crept over her as she stood, prepared to offer an explanation or guide him out of the room. But Rowan's next words stopped her cold. "Excuse me," he said, his voice faltering slightly. "Was your mother's name Linda?" Peyton blinked, utterly confused. "Yes. What does all this mean? How do you know my mother?" Rowan's face contorted with raw emotion, his eyes welling up. Before he could speak, a tear slipped down his cheek, and soon he was crying, unable to control the flood of feelings that overwhelmed him. His hands shook as he reached into his pocket, pulling out the old photograph and placing it gently on the table between them. It was the same picture Gemma had pointed to. "She is my mother too," Rowan finally said, his voice barely a whisper as he wiped his tears with the back of his hand. The weight of his words hung in the air. Peyton's heart raced, her mind reeling from the revelation. She stared at the photograph, then back at Rowan, speechless. The shock gripped her tightly as she sat down, her legs suddenly weak. Her eyes brimmed with unshed tears as she tried to make sense of it all. For a long moment the two of them sat in silence, the enormity of their shared connection sinking in. Rowan couldn't take his eyes off Peyton, and she, equally stunned, struggled to find her voice. This was her brother, the brother she thought she'd never meet. Peyton was the first to speak, though her voice trembled. "But how could this be? I thought I would never find you," she whispered, tears threatening to spill over. "I had given up all hope of ever meeting you." Upon hearing Peyton's last words, Rowan's face lit up with curiosity and a hint of disbelief. "You were looking for me? So, Mom told you about me? How much did you know?" His voice was soft, yet filled with the urgency of decades' worth of questions. Peyton nodded, her eyes misty but calm. "Very little," she admitted. "Just your name at first. Later, I found out your address. But when I finally got there, a different family was living in the house, and they knew nothing about the previous owners." Rowan opened his mouth to ask more, his mind swirling with the need for answers, but before he could, there was a sharp knock on the door. Zendaya and Mrs. Monroe entered the room. Mrs. Monroe, ever the critic, clicked her tongue disapprovingly, her eyes narrowing as they settled on Peyton. A chill passed between them, but Rowan didn't seem to notice, still caught in the emotional whirlwind of the revelation. He stood and gestured gently toward his wife. "Zendaya," he said quietly, "this is Peyton, my younger sister." The air seemed to freeze for a moment as the weight of Rowan's words sank in. Zendaya stood in stunned silence, her eyes flicking from Rowan to Peyton, struggling to process what she was hearing. Slowly, as the realization dawned that all the misunderstandings had been cleared, a faint smile tugged at the corners of Zendaya's lips. Relief washed over her, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from her heart. Mrs. Monroe, however, remained rigid, her cold stare fixed on Peyton. Yet, the newfound connection between the siblings softened the tension in the room. With the misunderstandings now settled, they finally had the chance to talk. Rowan, still emotional, couldn't contain the million questions that raced through his mind. "Tell me everything," he urged, his voice a mixture of excitement and disbelief. "I want to know everything about you." Peyton smiled warmly, feeling a sense of belonging she had thought would never come. She took a deep breath and began to share her story, her voice steady and calm. "I had a happy childhood," she started, her eyes shining with nostalgia. "I grew up in a small town. So beautiful, like something out of a picture book. My parents were everything to me. Dad worked as a doctor at the local hospital and Mom managed the house. She was always so full of life, cultivating the most beautiful flowers in our garden. I used to love watching her hum to herself while tending to her roses, her face lit up with such joy." Rowan listened intently, drinking in every detail, as if trying to make up for lost time. "In the evenings," Peyton continued, her voice softening, "we would sit down for dinner as a family. Dad would scoop me up and spin me around the kitchen, making me laugh until I could barely breathe. We'd talk, laugh, and enjoy Mom's cooking. But sometimes I would catch her looking sad, like she was thinking of something far away. When she thought no one was watching, she'd quietly wipe away her tears." Peyton paused, her brow furrowing slightly as she recalled those moments. "I asked her once about how she met Dad. I wanted to hear the love story that brought them together, but she never told me the whole thing. She'd start the story, then stop halfway through, as if something was too painful to remember." Peyton's mother always skipped over the parts of her life before she met Peyton's father. It was as if those years were sealed off, a distant memory too painful to revisit. But one warm afternoon, while searching for a doll in the attic that her mother had put away the previous summer, Peyton made a discovery she would never forget. As she rummaged through the dust-covered shelves, she spotted an old, worn box tucked behind a stack of forgotten books. Curious, she pulled it out and lifted the lid. Inside were photographs, yellowed with age. One photograph in particular caught her eye. It was of a boy who looked eerily like herself, cradled in her mother's arms. Her heart skipped a beat. "Mom! Mom, look what I found!" Peyton called excitedly as she rushed down the stairs, the photographs clutched in her hand. Her mother was in the living room tidying up when Peyton burst in. The little girl thrust the photo into her mother's hands. The moment her mother's eyes fell upon the picture, she gasped, her face draining of colour. Without a word, she sank into a nearby chair, staring at the photograph as if it had resurfaced a memory she had long buried. "Where did you find these, Peyton?" her mother asked, her voice trembling. "Up there, in the attic," Peyton answered, her excitement now tempered by confusion. "But who is this boy, Mom? He looks so much like me." Her mother didn't answer right away. Her eyes remained glued to the photograph, her hands shaking slightly as she traced the edges of the worn picture. The silence felt heavy, stretching on as Peyton waited for an explanation. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, her mother looked up and whispered, her voice soft and pained. "The boy in the photograph is your older brother." Peyton's heart pounded in her chest. "My brother?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "But why? Why haven't you told me about him?" Her mother's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. She gently pulled Peyton into her arms, stroking her hair as if trying to comfort them both. "I was always scared," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Scared that if I told you about him, it would make your life harder. I wanted you to grow up in joy and love, not burdened by sorrow and pain. But I didn't realize how wise and grown up my little girl has become." Peyton hugged her mother tightly, trying to absorb the enormity of what she had just learned. It was the first and last time her mother ever spoke about her brother. After that day, the subject was never brought up again. Not long after that revelation, tragedy struck. Peyton's parents were involved in a terrible car accident. The driver of an oncoming vehicle had lost control, crashing into their car. Her father survived, though badly injured, but her mother. Despite fighting for several hours in the hospital, her mother couldn't make it. She was gone, leaving Peyton with the memories of a woman who had loved her deeply and a secret that would forever change her life. As Peyton recounted this part of her story, Rowan listened, his throat tightening. Even after all these years, the mention of his mother's death felt like a fresh wound. He had missed so much. His sister's childhood, his mother's final years, and the weight of that loss hung heavily between them. Rowan, still processing everything, looked at Peyton with deep curiosity and asked, "What happened next? How did you live after that?" Peyton took a deep breath, the memories flowing back as she spoke. "After the accident, it was just my father and me. We managed to get through the dark times by leaning on each other. He did everything, more than I could have ever asked for, to make sure I was happy. I never asked him about you because I didn't want to reopen old wounds or cause him pain. But when I turned 18, he told me himself. He believed I had the right to know." Rowan nodded thoughtfully, his heart full of appreciation. "Your father is a good man." Peyton smiled warmly. "Yes, he is. He's wonderful." For a moment they sat together in silence, each of them reflecting on the years lost and the bond newly discovered. Rowan's expression darkened slightly with regret. "Just think about it," he murmured. "We've wasted so much time." Zendaya, sitting beside her husband, gently placed her hand on his, giving it a comforting squeeze. She looked at Peyton with a soft, warm smile. "Let's not dwell on the time we've lost," she said, her voice filled with reassurance. "It's up to us to decide how we use the time we have now. We can make sure we don't have any regrets moving forward." Rowan exhaled, feeling a bit of the tension lift from his shoulders. He looked over at his sister and nodded. "You're right," he agreed, his tone more optimistic now. That evening they extended an invitation to Peyton and her father, Alan Piper, to join them for dinner, wanting to bridge the gap and build on their newfound family bond. Later that night, they all gathered at a local restaurant. Alan arrived, and Rowan was immediately struck by how pleasant and cultured the man was. He spoke with grace, always thoughtful in his words, and the tenderness with which he treated Peyton was impossible to miss. His eyes never strayed far from her, and he quietly looked after her needs with an air of calm devotion. Rowan watched them closely, his admiration for Alan growing as the evening went on. Yet, as he continued to observe his sister, an odd thought started to take root in his mind. It was subtle at first, but it soon became something he couldn't shake. Peyton, though strikingly similar to their mother, had one distinct feature that set her apart. Her eyes, her green eyes, flecked with gold, were completely unlike their mother's soft grey eyes or Alan's deep brown ones. But Rowan recognised them. They were identical to his own, and to someone else's. "Mr. Piper, may I ask you a question?" Rowan approached Alan after watching him all evening, waiting for the right moment. The women, along with Gemma, had just gone to freshen up, leaving the two men alone. Alan turned to him with a knowing smile. "You've been watching me all evening. I'd be the last fool if I didn't realise what you were trying to ask." He paused, studying Rowan's face carefully. "And yes, the answer to your question is, yes, it's true." Rowan was momentarily taken aback despite expecting the confirmation. "Have you always known?" he asked quietly, his voice laced with disbelief. "From the very first day," Alan replied. "Linda told me immediately, and even if she hadn't, I would have figured it out over time. But Peyton doesn't know. Rowan felt a mix of emotions swirl within him. Alan had known all along and yet had loved and raised Peyton as his own. The magnitude of that kind of love struck Rowan deeply. Alan leaned in slightly, his voice low and steady. "If you're planning to tell her, please, choose another time, not today." Rowan nodded immediately, respecting Alan's wishes. "Of course. Don't worry about it." Alan gave him a grateful smile. "Thank you." In that moment, Rowan's respect for Alan deepened even further. Despite knowing the truth from the beginning, Alan had stepped into Peyton's life and provided her with a loving home, treating her as his own daughter without hesitation. His unwavering care and dedication had given Peyton a stable, happy life, something Rowan was profoundly grateful for. Alan had not only loved Peyton, but had also brought a measure of joy and peace to Linda's life. Rowan's heart warmed at the thought. That night, as Rowan lay in bed, he found his mind wandering back to his own father, Winston. They hadn't spoken in years, but now, after everything that had surfaced, Rowan felt an inexplicable pull to reach out. He had questions of his own, questions only his father could answer. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to reconnect. The next day, Rowan stood outside a small, worn apartment door, his heart racing. He hesitated for a moment, then knocked firmly. Inside, Winston grumbled as he rose from his old, creaky chair, his joints stiff. It had been years since anyone had knocked on his door, and he wasn't expecting any visitors. His only interactions these days were with food delivery couriers, and this wasn't one of those times. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice gruff and wary. "It's me," came the voice from the other side of the door. "Please, open the door." Winston stood frozen behind the door, momentarily stunned. The voice on the other side, it sounded like his son. But after all these years, how could it be? He had spent so much time drowning in guilt and regret, too paralyzed to make the first move. Maybe this was just his mind playing tricks on him, a hallucination born of longing. But something urged him to open the door. Taking a deep breath, Winston grasped the knob and slowly pulled it open. Standing in the doorway was a tall young man, staring straight at him with those familiar, piercing green eyes. It was Rowan. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air was thick with years of unspoken words, unshed tears, and unresolved hurt. Winston, still processing the reality of his son's presence, silently stepped aside, gesturing for Rowan to come in. Rowan stepped into the dimly lit apartment, avoiding eye contact as he nervously began to speak, words tumbling out in a rush. "Dad, I was scared. Scared that if I didn't come today, I'd regret it later. There are things I need to tell you, and we need to sort out our relationship once and for all." Winston's heart pounded in his chest, his hands shaking as he struggled to find the right words. But before Rowan could say more, Winston spoke, his voice raw and full of emotion. "I'm sorry." Rowan stopped mid-sentence, his eyes snapping to his father's face in disbelief. "What?" he asked, his voice uncertain. Winston met his son's gaze, and for the first time in Rowan's life, he saw something entirely unfamiliar in his father's eyes. Remorse, pain, and a lifetime of regret. The strong, stubborn, uncompromising man Rowan had known his whole life now stood hunched and weathered before him, his once bright green eyes dulled by years of solitude and sorrow. "Please," Winston continued, his voice cracking, "please forgive me for everything, son. I owe you, and your mother, so much. I regret everything." His words spilled out as if they had been bottled up for too long, his tone filled with desperation. "How I wish I could make things right, but I fear that even if I were to live my life over, I would act just as I did before. It took years of loneliness, long, endless days for me to realize how wrong I was. I've thought about calling you so many times, but I was afraid you wouldn't want to hear me. God, I'm such a coward." Rowan stood there, speechless, as he took in the torrent of emotions pouring out of his father. This was not the man he had prepared to confront. Winston, who had always been stern, arrogant, and unyielding, now looked broken, vulnerable. His father, who had once seemed indomitable, was now pleading for forgiveness. For years, Rowan had imagined this moment. What he would say, how he would demand answers, how he might finally get the confrontation he had longed for. But none of that prepared him for this. For the first time, his father was speaking from the heart, and it left Rowan utterly stunned. "Dad, I had no idea." Rowan sighed, his voice filled with the weight of the moment. Winston looked at his son, his heart heavy with concern. He knew he had ruined so much in their lives. "Son, you hate me, and I understand. I deserve it." Rowan shook his head, his eyes softening. "I don't hate you, Dad, and we'll talk about everything, I promise. But right now, there's something else I need to tell you." He hesitated, his breath catching in his throat as he tried to find the right words. "If it weren't for one thing. Honestly, I don't know if I would have come to see you at all." Winston's brows furrowed as he sensed something important was coming. Rowan faltered slightly before blurting out, "Dad, you have a daughter." The room went still. Winston, visibly stunned, stopped in his tracks, as though the words had knocked the air from his lungs. His heart skipped a beat, and for the first time in years, he felt an unfamiliar sensation. Hope. His legs felt weak, and he asked to sit down, his mind racing to catch up with what Rowan had just revealed. As Rowan began telling Winston everything, the weight of his father's silence filled the room. Winston's initial shock was slowly replaced with a flood of emotions. By the next day, he knew what he had to do. He had to meet Alan, the man who had raised his daughter. The following afternoon, Winston sat nervously across from Alan in a quiet room, his hands trembling as he fiddled with the button on his shirt sleeve. The silence between them felt thick and oppressive. After what felt like an eternity, Winston finally broke it. "I've hated you all my life," he admitted, his voice shaky. "I thought you were the man who stole my wife, who stole Linda from me." Alan remained quiet, his expression calm but understanding. Winston's eyes drifted to the photographs of Peyton that decorated the walls. Seeing her life, her happiness, and her presence in this home, surrounded by the love Alan had given her, began to stir something deeper inside him. Slowly, tears welled up in Winston's eyes. Despite his best efforts to control them, they spilled over. Alan watched quietly as Winston's resolve crumbled, offering only a weak but compassionate smile. "It's okay, Winston," he said gently. Unable to hold back any longer, Winston broke down completely. His sobs filled the room as the years of regret and bitterness poured out. Alan stood, walking over to him. Without hesitation, he extended his arms and pulled Winston into a strong embrace. Winston's voice cracked as he choked out the words between sobs. "Forgive me. Please forgive me. And thank you. Thank you for everything. Thank you for raising my daughter and for becoming her real father." Alan held Winston for a long moment before stepping back slightly, keeping a firm hand on his shoulder. "Linda never spoke ill of you," Alan said softly, his eyes full of empathy. "She never held a grudge. She only remembered that you saved her life once." Those words shattered whatever was left of Winston's composure. He wept uncontrollably, feeling the full weight of the years lost, the love he hadn't shown, and the bitterness that had only served to alienate him further from the ones he loved. "I'm sorry," Winston repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm so sorry." Meeting Alan had been a revelation for Winston. He saw in Alan the man he could never have been, someone who, despite life's many hardships, had remained committed, caring, and unwaveringly supportive. Winston realized that this was the kind of father and husband that Linda and Peyton had always deserved. Alan had provided them with the love and security Winston had failed to give. And as painful as it was to admit, Winston decided not to disrupt his daughter's life. He didn't want to shatter the beautiful world where her father was Alan. It was a decision that weighed heavily on his heart, but he knew it was the right one. Winston didn't feel worthy of the title of father. 6 months passed. "Peyton, why is it taking so long?" Rowan asked anxiously, pacing back and forth outside the delivery room. His voice was taut with nervous energy. Peyton sat calmly nearby, holding Gemma on her lap and flipping through a picture book to keep the little girl entertained. "Rowan, calm down. This isn't your first time becoming a father," she said with a knowing smile. Rowan sighed, rubbing his hands together nervously. "It's not the first time, but this time feels different." Peyton's smile grew wider. She knew exactly why it felt different, but Zendaya had strictly forbidden her from spilling the secret. Just then, the doors to the delivery room swung open, and a nurse stepped out, looking amused at the sight of Rowan's restless pacing. "Are you still here?" she asked, her tone light. Rowan looked up at her with weary, questioning eyes. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The nurse gave him a reassuring smile. "Don't worry, everything went well. The boys are a little weak, but that's completely normal for twins. They'll be just fine by tomorrow." Rowan blinked, his brain struggling to process the words. "Boys?" he muttered, his voice barely audible. "Twins?" Peyton stifled a laugh, pressing her fist to her mouth to keep from bursting out loud. Rowan turned and gave her a stern look. "You knew," he said, mock outrage filling his voice. "What kind of sister are you?" Still holding back a giggle, Peyton shrugged. "A good one who knows how to keep a secret." Rowan sank into his chair, running his hands through his hair in disbelief. "So, what you're saying is, I have 2 sons?" The nurse nodded, still smiling warmly. "Exactly. Looks like your wife had a surprise for you." Rowan sat there for a moment, his mouth hanging open in a daze. Then a goofy grin spread across his face. "2 sons?" he repeated almost to himself. Then suddenly he sprang up from his chair, scooping Peyton and Gemma into a spontaneous group hug. "2 sons! Wow!" Laughter erupted around them, and the joy was palpable. Life, as Rowan mused, was indeed full of surprises. Later that evening, after returning home, the entire family gathered for a grand celebratory dinner. It was an occasion marked by laughter, warmth, and shared love. The house was filled with the aromas of freshly cooked food and the sound of clinking glasses. When everyone had taken their seats around the table, Alan glanced at his watch, stood up, and cleared his throat. The room quieted down, and all eyes turned to him. "I'm glad we're all here tonight," Alan began, his voice steady yet tinged with emotion. "I'm truly happy for you, Rowan and Zendaya. I've watched your family grow, and it brings me great joy." He paused, his eyes scanning the room. A weight seemed to hang over him, and everyone sensed it. "I also need to apologize," he continued, glancing at Rowan. "I made a decision without consulting you. I invited your father, Rowan." The room fell silent instantly. Alan hesitated, his eyes shifting toward Peyton. He had been deeply concerned about how she would react, the truth he had kept from her now lingering in the air. He took a breath and pressed on. "I know he once caused Linda, and all of us, a lot of pain. But people can change, and Winston has. He's repented. We all need to be forgiving, to give him a second chance." As if on cue, Winston entered the room. His steps were slow and measured, his face etched with years of sorrow and longing. The room, once filled with warmth and light-hearted conversation, now seemed weighed down by anticipation. At first, Peyton smiled at the new guest, but then her expression changed. The colour drained from her face as she stared at Winston, recognition slowly dawning on her. Her smile vanished, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. The room held its collective breath as Peyton's eyes locked on Winston's watery ones. He stood there, vulnerable, as the reality of who he was and what he had meant in their lives hit her like a tidal wave. She took a deep breath, her chest tightening, unable to speak as her mind raced to process this revelation. "Hello, Peyton," Winston said quietly, his voice soft but filled with a deep sadness. Nobody spoke. The silence was thick, everyone waiting for Peyton's reaction. The tension was palpable, the weight of the past bearing down on them all. "I'm so sorry," Winston said again, his voice barely more than a whisper, as though the words themselves were too fragile for the moment. Peyton felt a lump form in her throat. She opened her mouth to say something, but nothing came out. Her emotions were too tangled, too raw. She began, but the words wouldn't come. Her mind was flooded with thoughts, anger, confusion, sympathy, and a strange sense of loss. But she couldn't speak. Not yet. Winston, sensing her turmoil, offered a sad, understanding smile. He nodded slowly as if he had expected this reaction. "Take your time, Peyton," he said gently. "I've waited this long. I can wait a bit more." The tension in the room eased slightly as Winston's words hung in the air. Though the moment was heavy, there was also the beginning of something else, something new. After that night, the family's dynamics began to shift. It wasn't easy. There were awkward silences, uncomfortable moments, and misunderstandings. But bit by bit, Peyton grew more comfortable with Winston's presence. He didn't force his way in. He remained gentle, always a little distant, but making an effort to be there. Slowly, their relationship strengthened, piece by piece. Meanwhile, Rowan and Zendaya's two healthy boys brought both joy and chaos into their lives, filling the home with laughter, cries, and the joyful noise of a growing family. Gemma adored her new brothers, doting on them and playing the role of the protective older sister. The house, once filled with the quiet of long-lost reunions, now buzzed with the energy of new beginnings. Winston became a regular part of their lives, visiting often but never overstaying. He had lost so many years, but now determined to make the most of the time he had left, he was present, offering what little he could. And even though he had once been estranged from them all, he found a place in their lives. As for Alan, he watched it all unfold with a deep sense of satisfaction. He had raised Peyton as his own, loving her unconditionally through every stage of her life. Now he saw his family coming together, becoming whole in a way that once seemed impossible. It was bittersweet, but he knew he had made the right decisions, and with that, he found peace. Phil walked out of the room, frustration building within him. He ran a hand through his curly brown locks, blue eyes narrowed after the conversation with his financial advisor. He had always known that going to college was a toss-up for him. It was never going to be that easy for someone from a rural town in Middle America. Phil tried his best to work hard, get good grades, and save as much money as he could for college. But no amount of savings would help him afford even a fraction of what it cost for college. From a young age, Phil knew he wanted to study medicine. He had always wanted to help people. And what better way than to work in medicine? It was the best way to help people, so going to med school was the best way for him to do this. Phil applied to all the scholarships he could think of. It helped, but med school was expensive, and there was still a lot of money Phil had to put towards tuition. This left the dreaded student loans. He didn't want to apply for loans, but there was no choice. Everything seemed okay at first. Phil got to college, moved into his dorms, and prepared to start his first semester. Until a few days before starting, he was called to his advisor's office at the college. He had to speak to Phil about an urgent issue. That never sounded good, but Phil tried to think positively. Phil knocked on the door, stomach flip-flopping when Mr. Ramos told him he could come in. "Come in, Phil." He smiled, trying to keep up a positive front. "Hello, Mr. Ramos. What is it you need to talk to me about?" "It's about your tuition." "What about it? I have scholarships and loans to take care of everything." Mr. Ramos's smile faltered. "See, that's the thing, Phil. There was a hiccup with one of your scholarships, and they ended up not being able to put forward the required amount towards your tuition, so you have an outstanding balance." "And how long do I have to pay off this balance?" This time the smile faded completely. "It needs to be paid by the end of the month." "Mr. Ramos, I can't possibly pay something off that quickly. I need more time." "I'll try to get you some more time, but they are going to expect the payment sooner or later, Phil." "What about payments?" He winced. "I'll try to work towards getting them to allow you to make payments, rather than needing the lump sum." He thought back on the encounter, blood boiling beneath the surface, but there was also despair. All Phil wanted was to work hard and get an education. Wasn't that supposed to be the American dream? He couldn't pay this off, at least not all at once. The only person Phil could think to call was his mother. He needed to tell her about the situation, and when he did, Mum would insist on paying what she could toward it. It didn't feel good when he took her money, but he did need to make some kind of payment on it. So the sooner he could make the payment, the better. Phil dialed his mother's number and didn't have to wait long for her to pick up. "Phil, how did the meeting go?" He sighed softly. "It didn't go very well, Mum. They need me to make this huge payment by the end of the month, or I won't be able to continue with school." "Oh, honey," Mum whispered. "Listen, I'll send you some money right now, okay? It's only a little bit right now, but it should get you through the next few days until I can scrounge up more for you to make a proper payment." "No, Mum, Phil," Mum said dangerously. "Listen, I know you are probably low on spending money given this whole tuition debacle, so let me send you a little bit. I don't want you to have to remain inside all weekend. This will make you worry more." Some places in the town that surround campus only took cash. It was an old town with the college being built around it, essentially. "But what about the tuition payment, Mum? That's going to be too much for you." "Don't worry about it. Just know if you need some spending money, it's in the account." Phil didn't think he'd need it, but his roommates invited him to go out with a group of friends that evening and get some pizza. This particular pizza place only took cash, so Phil ended up having to take a bus into town to go to the ATM. There should have been an ATM on campus, but there wasn't. An oversight, but Phil had enough to worry about right now. The best place to go was the local grocery store in town. It was where a lot of students ended up going at all hours of the night when they needed some late-night snacks for whatever reason. When he got off the bus, it was the middle of the day, so there weren't many people around. He went towards the grocery store, a frown playing on his lips when he realized it was closed for lunch. "Damn," Phil mumbled, glancing at his phone to see what time it was. It was 10 minutes to 1, so he still had at least 15 minutes until he had to get back to work. Sighing, Phil leaned against the wall of the store. He had no choice but to wait it out. "The store will be open soon," a raspy voice called out. Phil blinked and looked to his right. He saw an older man in his 40s standing a few feet away, perched on an old picnic table placed in front of the market. The man had long, straggly, greying-brown hair, pulled back into a light ponytail. He was bopping his head to some music playing on his cracked phone that had seen better days. Phil could tell the guy was homeless from his worn-out clothes and homely appearance, but he had this bright smile on his face. It was a little impressive for him to be able to smile so much in the face of such difficulty. "What are you listening to?" Phil asked curiously. "Bob Dylan's masterpiece, Blowing in the Wind," he said wistfully. "Please tell me you know Bob Dylan. I know you're young, but this is a musical genius we're talking about." Phil laughed. "I know Bob Dylan. My mom's a huge fan." "Name's Sam, by the way," he said, holding out his hand towards Phil. "I'm Phil." Sam smiled. "What brings you here, Phil?" I'm just waiting for the grocery store to open. I need to use the ATM. Suddenly Sam started laughing, which caught him off guard. You're not from here, are you? What makes you think that? He chuckled. The ATM in the grocery store hasn't worked for over 6 months. Phil leaned in, trying to catch a look at the ATM through the window. He shielded the sun's rays from his eyes and could see the out-of-order sign positioned right on top of the machine. Crap, Sam was right. The machine was out of order. He looked over at Sam, who was still bopping along to his music. You were right, Sam. The ATM isn't working. Told you, Sam laughed. But I'll tell you how to get to the nearest ATM if you're willing to listen. Phil blinked. Yes, of course. Just around the corner, there is a barber shop that belongs to George. Good guy, quiet, but always listens. If you look across the street, you'll see a flower shop and there you'll find an ATM. Don't mention that I sent you there, though. I got drunk one night and broke some of her flower pots outside the shop, so she's not a fan of mine. He couldn't help but laugh. Thanks a lot, Sam. Sam shook his head. No problem. While he did need to go to the ATM, Phil lingered behind. Sam was a very curious and interesting man. He didn't want to end the conversation so quickly. Are you from here? Born and raised, Sam said proudly. I left for a couple of years, but eventually found myself back here. It hit Phil that Sam was wearing a basketball jersey. The jersey was old and bad for wear, but it was a basketball jersey. Did you ever play basketball? Asking that question was like opening Pandora's box because Sam's eyes lit up. He looked so happy. I love basketball. It was my life for so many years. I played it in high school and continued to after graduation. Phil ended up sitting down beside Sam while he gave his monologue. Being this close to Sam made the bruise on the left side of his face very noticeable. Not only that, but he could smell booze coming off him in droves. Why don't you play anymore? Sam pulled up his pants legs to reveal thick varicose veins on his calves. These here pretty much guaranteed that I wouldn't be able to play professionally anymore. It was quite a difficult sight to see. The veins were bulging and looked ready to pop at any moment. Phil immediately felt for him because of how painful it looked. Why haven't you treated them before? He shrugged. It's not that serious. Sam, it looks pretty serious. Look, kid, I'll be straight with you, okay? Sam muttered. I don't have the money for one, and I honestly don't care. Any money I do get, I spend on booze, so it's not like I'll save anything towards surgery. Before Phil could say anything, a woman came out of the grocery store, ASC, owl on her face. Sam, what are you doing just sitting there? Lunch ended 10 minutes ago, so it's time for you to get back to work. Sam shot Phil a grin. I need to get back to work. See you around, kid. He watched Sam walk back inside and felt sadness weighing heavily on his chest. It was a shame that Sam had resigned himself to living with this pain. Phil wished he could do something to help him in some way. Shaking his head, Phil headed down to the flower shop. When he got there, he tried to make sure that he didn't knock over any pots. If Sam was to be believed, and Phil did believe him, then it was best to avoid causing even the smallest amount of damage. Sure enough, the ATM was nestled in the back of the store. The owner eyed him but stopped when an older couple came in after him, looking around the shop. It was full of flowers and other arrangements, but Phil paid them no mind. He was more focused on getting some money from the ATM and getting back to college, but his mind kept drifting back to Sam. The man seemed so easygoing and free despite all his problems. He was homeless, in chronic pain, and had an issue with drinking. It pulled at Phil's heartstrings. There's always someone in the world who has it harder than you. Phil knew he never had it easy in life. He was raised by a single mother who worked practically every day of the week, which resulted in him becoming a latchkey kid by the time he was in his pre-teens. Phil didn't hold any bitterness towards his mother. He admired her because she did everything she could to give him a roof over his head, food on the table, and clothes on his back. He tried to take some of the burden off his mother when he was old enough to work. It wasn't fair for her to have to work so hard, but a teenager could only make so much money. Working and juggling school proved to be almost too much. but he powered through. The one thing that did suffer was Phil's personal life. He didn't get to hang out with friends, date much, or do anything normal teenagers got to do. Phil didn't regret one moment of his high school career. It got him to this point. However, he felt a sense of bitterness taking over him again. What if all that hard work during his high school years was for nothing? The college tuition needed to be paid for this semester. Mr. Ramos said he'd try to get them to let Phil make payments, but he didn't think they would. They wanted their money. It didn't matter if Phil was a struggling student who had to take out student loans. All they cared about was making as much money as they could from their students. Phil started to wonder if it was a good idea to go to college in the first place. He could have gone to community college or a trade school. Sure, Phil did want to have a medical career, but he could have done something else, maybe become a nurse or a nurse aide. But his mother wanted him to reach for the stars. She didn't think something as simple as being in a lower income bracket should prevent Phil from reaching his dreams. Phil knew his mother meant well. She just wanted more for him than she got out of life. His father left when he was still in diapers. They weren't married, and his father didn't pay any child support. It wasn't like his mother didn't try to go after him and get him to pay, but the guy kept moving, never staying in one place or at one job. After getting the money from the ATM, Phil headed back to the bus stop. He walked by the grocery store and looked around for Sam but didn't see him. The guy must have been busy working. With a sigh of disappointment, he continued on his way back to the bus stop. It didn't take the bus long to come and bring him back to college, but his mind kept reminding him of Sam. The week of school finally started, and Phil wished he could only spend his time worrying about adjusting to college. However, all he could worry about was his incoming payment for his tuition. It was all he could think about right now. Mr. Ramos contacted Phil over the weekend. The second he called him, Phil picked up the phone. His heart was hammering in his chest, and his stomach was doing a huge number of flip-flops. It was more than he could stand. "Mr. Ramos?" Phil asked, picking up his phone on the second ring. "Yes. Hello, Phil. I spoke with those at the financial office, and they say that while they can give you until the end of the month, they won't let you make payments." Phil struggled to speak. It felt like his world was closing around him and all he could do was stand there. "So I have until the end of the month, or I'll be kicked out of the college?" "Yes, unfortunately that is going to be the case, Phil. I will keep trying, but they are pretty set in their ways." "Thanks for trying, Mr. Ramos," he sighed. "And I'm going to keep trying my best to get them to reconsider." What Phil wanted to say was that he wouldn't hold his breath, but he didn't want to bring Mr. Ramos down more than he already was. Every day that passed meant that it was one day closer to leaving college. The annoying part about it was that Phil was starting to get into college. He was enjoying going to class, living with his roommate, and just the campus experience. So Phil had to make a choice. Either he could sit there and struggle for the rest of the month, living in abject sadness, or he could try to enjoy the time he had left. It was crazy that he was going to make himself miserable for the remaining time he had. All he could do was make the most out of the few weeks he had here. If he didn't, Phil would regret it. He wasn't going to tell his mother about what was happening. As far as Phil's mother Laura was concerned, she would think that they decided to let him make payments. Then, at the end of the month, Phil would move back home and drop the bomb on his mother. It felt a bit like fooling his mother, but Phil didn't care. He didn't want his mother to feel like she didn't do enough for him. After class one day, Phil decided to go to a dance show that was in the college gym. It was open to the whole campus, and with a free few hours, he decided to go there. This was a part of the college he had never been to before. Phil almost lost his way a few times, but the joy of using a smartphone meant he could easily find his way. On his way to the gym, he came across a display that showcased all the famous athletes who had graduated from the college. As someone who loved basketball, Phil was automatically intrigued by all the famous athletes who had gone to this college at some point. What intrigued Phil was one particular picture. The player in the picture looked very familiar. He saw a couple more pictures of the man, including one where the man was with his team. Sam? Phil asked, eyes widening. No, it couldn't be. The homeless man he met the other day couldn't be this famous basketball player from the team pictured here, yet they could be twins. It was a little uncanny how much they looked alike. The closer Phil looked, the more he remembered everything Sam told him the other day. I love basketball. It was my life for so many years. I played it in high school and continued to after graduation. This was exactly what Sam had told him. While the guy in the pictures was a few decades older, it was Sam. Phil couldn't deny that. He wondered how Sam ended up being the star basketball player in college to being homeless, struggling with a drinking problem. It said underneath that Sam used to play the position of guard. He smiled sadly, wishing that Sam hadn't ended up with those thick, bulging veins in his feet. For some reason, Sam was never able to get them fixed, and it led to his current situation. Phil eventually wandered away from the display, wanting to get to the dance show and not miss anything, but he was unable to concentrate much on it. His mind kept drifting back to Sam. How was Sam doing right now? He seemed to do some odd jobs around town, but that couldn't pay much. Phil wondered where he stayed at night. It was likely some abandoned building or somewhere public like under a bridge or in the park. Despite all that, Sam still had that bright, goofy smile on his face. Phil thought of it and found himself starting to smile as well. Over the next week, Phil was busy adjusting to school. He was adjusting pretty well and trying not to let the fact that he might have to drop out at the end of the month bother him. Phil's mother was still under the impression that he could make payments. When his mother called him one evening saying that she had managed to scrounge together a lot of the money, he was thrown for a loop. "How?" Phil asked his mother. She laughed. "I have my ways." "Mom, you didn't have to do that, whatever you did." "You're my son," she told Phil. "If I don't take care of you, who will?" "I'm an adult," Phil tried to argue. On the other end, his mum laughed and cut him off. "Phil, you're 18. You are barely an adult." He decided it was pointless to argue with his mother and accepted what she was saying right now. The point was the money was in the account now. He could stop back at his dorm, write a check, and then write out a check for the financial office. It would cover whatever was left on his bill. Phil wouldn't have to worry about getting kicked out of college. He would be able to work towards achieving the goal of getting a medical degree. It was all he had ever wanted. But the moment Phil got to the closed door leading to the financial aid office, he stopped in his tracks. He couldn't stop thinking about Sam and those bulging veins in his calves. Slowly, Phil looked down at the check in his hands. Phil had yet to write any other information besides the amount on the check. The check was still a blank check. Phil could easily make the check out to anyone. He didn't have to go to the financial office to pay his tuition. There were so many ways Phil could work in the medical field without becoming a doctor or something that required years and years of schooling. He could get a lesser degree and work as a nurse or something. It still cost money, but not as much as the schooling he was looking towards doing. Slowly, Phil began to walk away from the financial aid office. His feet took him to the bus stop right outside campus. Phil waited for the next bus, acting as if he was on autopilot. It wasn't fair that Sam had to keep suffering day after day. Phil had this check here, and if he could put this money towards helping him afford surgery, then at least he would know the money was going to a good cause. Once Phil was in town, he started the search for Sam. He didn't know where he lived, so he decided to go straight to the grocery store. But Sam wasn't outside or inside. "Excuse me, is Sam here?" Phil asked the first worker he saw. The young woman blinked. "Sam? No, he doesn't work today." "Do you know where I can find him?" "I think he spends much of his free time at the park." Phil raced to the park. Sure enough, he found Sam there towards the picnic tables. He was bopping his head along to some music. "Bob Dylan again," Phil called out, causing Sam to jump. When he realized it was Phil, Sam grinned. "Phil! Fancy seeing you here," he greeted. "And of course, it's Bob Dylan, kid. I could listen to him on a loop for the rest of my life." Phil sat beside Sam. the check weighing heavily in his pocket. It was just a small piece of paper, but it felt like it weighed a ton. "Sam, how are the calves?" "Same as yesterday," he said with a chuckle. "Why so interested in my calves?" Phil smiled. I know I may be overstepping my bounds here, but I managed to raise some money at the college to cover the cost for you to get surgery." "Kid, you're not serious, are you?" "I have the check right here." To prove it to Sam, he showed him the check. The older man started to tear up and wiped his eyes with his dirty sleeve. "You didn't have to do that." "I know, but I wanted to do it," Phil insisted. "You can say no, Sam. No one can force you to accept the money and get the surgery, but know that this check is here if you want to go forward with it." Sam was quiet for a while, but eventually he spoke, and Phil was relieved by what he said. "All right, I'll do it." Phil grinned. "It makes me so happy to hear that, Sam." The same day, Phil accompanied Sam to the local clinic. It took over an hour of waiting for Sam to even get back to see a doctor, but when he came out, he had some papers. "They gave me a referral to this office that takes care of this sort of thing in the next town over. I have an appointment tomorrow." Sam looked uneasy, but Phil wasn't going to let him down. "I'll go with you." "Kid, don't you have classes or something?" Phil shook his head. "No, I don't have any classes tomorrow, so I'm free all day." The man looked relieved. Phil had a feeling that Sam wouldn't want to go by himself. After all, Phil was the one who was pushing him to get this surgery. He wouldn't even bother getting it done and would be content to suffer. It wasn't Sam's fault, of course. He had no money. Why would he even entertain the idea of getting it in the first place? Phil showed up in town bright and early. He paid for an Uber for them to go to the next town, noticing that Sam was very silent. "Second thoughts?" Phil asked. Sam shrugged. "No, but I'm not going to lie, kid. I'm nervous as hell about this. Never been one for surgery, and that hasn't changed over the years." "Well, if you want to back out, all you have to do is tell me so. I don't mind having the Uber turn back around and take us back to town." "No, kid, we've come this far, and I want to see it through." It was a relief for Phil to hear that. He settled back in the seat beside him and felt his heart beating wildly in his chest. That was it. They were here now, and there was no going back. It didn't take long for them to get in. When they were filling out the papers, Sam got a bit nervous, but Phil tried to assure him that it was going to be okay. He would pay for it, and it would all be okay. Unbeknownst to Sam, he did go ahead and check out the price. It turned out he had just enough to cover the cost of the surgery, much to his relief. If Phil wasn't able to cover it all, he didn't know what he would do. All of this would have ended up being for nothing. When Sam got called back, Phil gave him a thumbs up. A few minutes after he was called back, Phil was called to the front. "Excuse me, can I just have you confirm the spelling of the patient's name? I want to make sure I put it in right." "It's Rockhold." The woman paused. "Wait, it's not Rockfeld?" "No, I'm sorry, my handwriting is terrible. It's Rockhold." "Excuse me," she muttered, suddenly rushing off. When she returned, there was a doctor next to her. "Hello, I'm the doctor here. Are you Sam's relative?" "No, he's just a friend I recently met, and I'm here to pay for his surgery." The doctor blinked. "You want to pay for someone you barely know?" "Well, he can't afford it and has no means to save up the money," Phil told him. "I have the money, so I thought I'd help him out. Aren't we supposed to pay it forward for those less fortunate?" He blinked again. "Please, excuse me for a moment. I need to go check on Mr. Rockhold." It was a little bizarre to see the doctor suddenly rush off, but Phil waited. He ended up just sitting back down, waiting to see what was going to happen with Sam. After the man finally came out, Phil stood up and walked back to the counter. "Hello, sorry it took so long. I was just talking with Sam, and we've got him all set for surgery." "All right, can you just tell me how much it will be and where I can pay?" The doctor's smile widened. "That's not going to be necessary." "What?" "There's no need for you to pay. We're going to cover the entire treatment, so he has no remaining expenses." Phil blinked. "What do you mean?" "You don't have to pay anything, young man. It's all set." "But..." Phil started to say, but then he realized he shouldn't let himself get so upset by this because either way, Sam was getting the surgery and he still had his tuition money. Is that all? Yes. The doctor chuckled. I'll send Mr. Rockhold out after we confirm his surgery date. Thank you. Phil sat there, waiting for Sam to come out. He still couldn't believe everything that was happening. The doctor and the office were covering the surgery. Maybe they had some charity set aside for helping people who were struggling. This was the only thing Phil could think of that made sense. He wasn't going to look a gift horse in the mouth. Sam's surgery was going to be covered. This was amazing, and the best thing that ever could have happened. Ready to go, kid? Sam asked once he came out. Phil smiled and nodded. Yeah, let's go. The surgery was going to happen next week. It was on a day when Phil didn't have school, so he wouldn't have to worry about missing any classes. Everything seemed to be working out. If only Phil hadn't gotten ahead of himself. The surgery ended up being a huge success, much to everyone's relief, but after Sam recovered, he realized he had no other place to go. It was something Phil should have realized. He knew Sam was homeless, but still pushed forward. This meant he was further responsible for Sam and needed to help him. What kind of friend to Sam would he be if he didn't? Why don't you stay with me? Phil asked, catching Sam by surprise. Are you sure about that, kid? I don't want to get in the way of you and your roommate. Besides, does your roommate even want some old, injured guy to come stay with you for a few weeks? Phil grinned. I already brought it up to him, Sam. He says he's fine if you want to come stay with us, but you don't have to. I'll find some way to pay for a hotel if you... Kid, come on, you've done enough, he muttered. I'm not going to expect you to pay for a hotel after covering the surgery, so it's perfectly fine if I stay with you. Better than sleeping outside, anyway. He winced. I didn't pay for your surgery. Huh? The doctor and the clinic agreed to cover all your expenses for some reason. Can you believe it? Sam blinked. The doctor did ask if I was a basketball player randomly. Maybe that has something to do with it. He could have just noticed your jersey like I did. True, Sam muttered. None of it made sense, but Phil decided it was just one of those things that they would never have answers for. Perhaps the doctor just wanted to help out someone who was desperately in need of care. It's what Phil ended up doing, after all. He was willing to spend his tuition money on Sam's surgery because it felt like the right thing to do. Sam didn't have many things to his name, so when he moved into Phil's dorm, he had just one bag with him. Phil even went as far as to lend Sam some clothes. His clothes were worse for wear, and they were nearly the same size, so it didn't matter if he wore some of these things. You don't know how much this means to me, Phil, Sam said later that night as they were enjoying some pizza. I don't know why you're doing all this for some old drunken basketball player. Because I want to help, Sam. That's all there is to it. He nodded, giving Phil a grin. I get it, kid. Living with Sam wasn't that hard to adjust to. For most of the day, Sam was in town, working and doing odd jobs. Phil and his roommate were busy with class. Sam could move around better than ever, much to Phil's amazement. It was exactly why he wanted him to get the surgery in the first place. Sam might have a lot of other issues to figure out in life, but at least he could help take care of one. A few weeks after Sam moved in, Phil got a call from Dr. Jones. He had to rack his brain, but then he realized that Dr. Jones was the guy who did the surgery on Sam and said the whole surgery was taken care of. Phil wondered how he got his phone number, but he did put his number down on the form he helped Sam fill out. It explained why he had Phil's number. However, why was he reaching out to him? The surgery happened a while ago and Sam was doing fine. There should be no reason. Phil? He blinked. Oh, sorry, Dr. Jones, I just dazed out there. What were you saying about the reason why you called? I was hoping to invite you and Sam to dinner. Dinner? Phil asked with a frown. Okay, I think that sounds like a good idea. Can you text me the address? I'll let you know when I'm free so we can plan the dinner accordingly. Sounds good. The doctor sent the address. It was a small diner in town, but it had the best food. Phil had eaten there a few times, and he looked forward to eating there again. When Sam got back, Phil mentioned the phone call. Sam looked just as confused as he was. "They want us to come to dinner?" Sam asked, with a frown that soon broke into a grin. "Hey, it's a free, delicious meal, so I say let's go this weekend." Phil laughed. "All right, if you're good with going, then I will too." "Then it's a plan." Phil texted Dr. Jones back, letting him know that they could go sometime on the weekend. They decided on an early dinner on Saturday at around 4 p.m. The entire time he was getting ready, Phil was racking his brain trying to figure out what was going on. Why did Dr. Jones call him up out of the blue? It seemed like there was something hidden behind the doctor's offer, like he knew something they didn't, and for the life of him, he couldn't figure it out. The bus was a little late, so it ended up getting them to the town at exactly 4 p.m. Phil texted the doctor, trying to let him know that they were going to be a little late, but Dr. Jones assured him that they would be fine and it didn't matter if they were late. From the moment he and Sam walked into the diner, Phil spotted the doctor with the woman from behind the counter and another young woman. He was struck by how beautiful this woman was. She had long blonde hair, glittering blue eyes, and the prettiest smile. "Hello, Dr. Jones," Phil greeted. "Hello, Phil, Sam. This is my wife Madeline and daughter Emma," he said. "By the way, how is the foot, Sam?" Sam grinned. "It's doing a lot better now. I can move around and not be in pain. It's something I never thought I'd have." "That's great to hear," Dr. Jones exclaimed, motioning for them to sit. "So, Phil, how is school going?" Phil blinked. It's fine. I'm adjusting better than I thought I would, and looking forward to the coming semesters." He wondered how the doctor ever found out he was going to college. Did he say something back at the clinic? Phil didn't think he did, but maybe he had mentioned something while talking to Sam, and Madeline overheard since she was right there at the counter. After ordering their food, Dr. Jones cleared his throat. "Sam, before we eat, can I ask you something?" "Of course." He gestured towards his daughter. "I know I already introduced her, but does my daughter Emma Jones ring any bells for you?" Not really." "What about the Emma Jones of Willowbrook Fund?" Phil looked at Sam, who looked extremely confused, but then his eyes widened and tears sprang to his eyes. "This is little Emma Jones?" Emma smiled. "It's me, Sam." Sam started to cry, startling Phil. Dr. Jones chuckled, sensing how confused he was. "You see, Phil, Sam Rockhold is a legend in our family. Even after getting kicked off his basketball team after a bad season and not having a way to make more income, he still donated all of his money to help my daughter Emma here afford expensive treatment. She was very sick at the time, and without it, she would have passed." Phil gasped. "So when we went to the clinic a few weeks ago, you knew who he was?" "After you told my wife the correct name, I realized it was indeed Sam. You see, we have been looking for Sam all these years. We wanted to thank him and give back, but no matter how hard we looked, we couldn't find him. It was like he just vanished off the face of the earth." Sam sniffed. "I wanted to disappear once I couldn't play basketball anymore." "There is no shame in what has happened to you," Dr. Jones assured, giving Sam a warm smile. "And now that you are here, I want to properly thank you for helping our daughter." "It's not something you have to thank me for, Doctor. I knew the moment I saw that ad for donating to Emma's cause, I had to help. Sure, it would bankrupt me and make it so I had no more money, but I didn't care. This was the right thing to do." Emma stood up and held her arms out to Sam. "Sam, can I have a hug?" "Of course," Sam sobbed. He climbed out of the booth and then wrapped his arms around Emma. The scene made tears spring to Phil's own eyes. This was all unbelievable. Imagine that just running into Sam that one day led to all of this. It made Phil even more grateful that the whole issue with his tuition happened. If it hadn't, he never would have met Sam that day and started talking with him. Phil wiped at his eyes. I can't believe all of this. It's amazing how everything has worked out. Madeline, Dr. Jones's wife, smiled at Phil. Phil, I also want to thank you for helping a man you barely knew. You gave up your tuition money knowing you'd have to leave college at the end of the month. This is why we want to help you. He blinked. What? We admire you, Phil. You're the son of a hard-working single mother, and since you were willing to sacrifice your tuition for a random stranger, we are going to pay off your loans as well as any other expenses that arise during your college career. Phil said, choking up and unable to find the right words. Thank you so much. You don't know how much this means to me. Madeline smiled. We should be thanking you. If you didn't help Sam out, then we never would have been able to reach out to him again to give him our utmost thanks for saving our daughter's life. For a while, only the sounds of Sam weeping and Phil sniffing could be heard. After they gathered their emotions, they went back to eating. But just as dessert was being brought out, Madeline and Dr. Jones dropped another bomb. Sam, we already heard that you are struggling to look for housing and work, which is why we're going to help you find an apartment and get a job, Madeline said. There's a coaching job at the private school where our kids have gone, and we'd like you to work there as the basketball coach. Sam started to sob again. You two are doing too much for me. Sam, you helped give us the past 15 years with our daughter. There isn't enough thanks we can give you, Dr. Jones murmured, some tears streaming down his cheeks. Phil didn't bother trying to hide his tears this time. He couldn't believe how all of this was playing out. It almost seemed too good to be true. To make sure it was true, Phil reached up and pinched his cheek. No one noticed when Phil pinched himself or jumped slightly from the pain. When dessert came, it was difficult for Phil to turn off the waterworks and focus on eating. He was much too emotional right now. Wait until Phil told his mother about everything that was going on. She wasn't going to believe what had happened and would be so thrilled. Perhaps also a little angry when she learned Phil did try to use the tuition money for something else. But she would adjust to it and realize that Phil was only doing it because he cared for Sam. Phil's first semester went by very quickly, and so did the second semester. He was getting close to the end of his spring semester and was realizing that he would be returning home to his rural town for the summer. As much as he wanted to see his mother, he was a little saddened to be going because of his relationship with Emma. After meeting Emma that day at the diner, they got to talking. Phil learned that Emma was going to the same college but was a sophomore, whereas he was a freshman. Even though they were in different years, the two of them would meet up during lunch and whenever they didn't have classes. He felt this attraction and connection with Emma from the moment he saw her. Phil wasn't sure how Emma felt right away, so he decided to keep it to himself, not wanting to ruin what was growing between them. But then, one day, Emma was the one to confess her feelings, much to the surprise of Phil. The two were sitting on campus, just enjoying the nice weather. Phil turned to Emma and smiled, wishing that he could tell her he was in love with her. It might seem too soon, but Phil knew this was what he felt towards Emma. There was no denying that. Phil? He asked. Emma leaned forward, pressing her lips against his. Instantly, Phil froze up. She laughed and broke the kiss. I love you, Phil gaped. You love me? Yes, Emma said confidently. Do you feel the same way? She sounded unsure if it was a good idea for her to confess her feelings. He didn't want her to think that, but Phil knew how to remedy that. God, yes, Phil blurted out. I love you too. Emma giggled, throwing her arms around Phil. They kissed again, but this time Phil didn't freeze up. He kissed her back and was filled with this intense happiness. Phil didn't remember the last time he was ever this happy. I'm so glad you love me too. I was worried you didn't. Phil laughed. Really? I thought it was pretty obvious I felt the same way. I had an idea, but I couldn't be sure. Phil thought about this, a smile making its way onto his face. He couldn't believe that he and Emma ever got together. They were getting stronger than ever. When he told his mum about dating Emma, she started gushing about how happy she was for him and that she wanted to meet Emma right away. It took a long time for Phil to calm her down because she was so happy. Phil didn't date much in high school. He was too busy trying to keep his grades up and working. But now, Phil didn't have to spend all his free time at school or work. He had to focus on school. But he could also enjoy college like all the other students. It wouldn't be possible if not for Emma's parents. He was still so thankful for them that they decided to take care of his tuition. One day over the summer, Phil was intent on getting his mother together with Emma and Emma's parents. It would be a bit of a nerve-wracking meeting, but he knew it would work out in the end. As good as things were for Phil, things were even better for Sam. His life had changed so much since Phil met him at the grocery store that afternoon. Sam was still living in the apartment the Joneses provided him, and he was still working as a basketball coach at the private school. He still kept in contact with Sam. He met up with him after he was done with work at the private school. Phil remembered how happy he looked. Phil was waiting just outside the school. When Sam walked out, he smiled at him and waved to the older man. "Hey Sam, good to see you." Sam grinned. When they were close enough, he pulled Phil into a surprise hug, but Phil didn't hesitate to return it. "Good to see you too, kid. How are you doing?" "Pretty good," Phil told him. "School is still as challenging as ever, but I love the challenge." "How about you and Emma?" Phil cleared his throat. "We're doing good." This caused Sam to chuckle. "It sounds like the two of you are getting serious. Are you getting serious?" He couldn't help the flush that came to his cheeks. "Yeah, we are." "Then you'll have to invite me to the wedding," Sam teased. Phil's eyes widened. "Wedding, Sam? It's a little too early to be talking about a wedding." "Never too early." Even though Sam was teasing him, it was good to be spending some time with him. The two talked for a while at the school, but then ended up going for a bite to eat. Sam told him all about how he loved coaching his students. He said they always managed to put a smile on his face and wanted to learn. The thing Phil noticed as Sam told this story was how happy he looked. In the entire time he'd known Sam, the man always had a genuine smile. But this one was different. It looked like it was free of worries. After sharing a meal, the two hugged again. "I need to get back to school," Phil said reluctantly. Sam grinned. "It's all right. I'll see you this weekend if you have some free time, okay? Just give me a call. I do have a phone now." "I should have some free time. If not, I'll make some free time for you, Sam." As strange as it was, Sam had become his best friend. They were in two different stages of life, and Sam was much older. But this was how Phil felt. He hadn't asked Sam, but he was pretty sure he felt the same way. Now, the day before Phil was set to go back home for the summer, he and Emma went for a walk on the hiking trail near the school. They walked for a while, eventually sitting down on some rocks and gazing at the mountains in the distance. This was exactly why the two of them decided to come out here. Emma suggested catching the sunset and watching how it disappeared behind the mountains. Phil had been wanting to do that since he came here but never had the chance. Now he did. "You know, it's an amazing sight," Emma whispered, resting her head on his shoulder. "It is." Emma smiled. "I'm glad that we'll have this moment to keep us going for the rest of the summer." He chuckled. "Same here." As Phil sat there with Emma enjoying the sunset, he was struck by the idea of how everything had changed for him. When he first came to college, he wasn't even sure he would be able to finish the semester because of payment issues. Yet now he didn't have to worry about his college being paid for. Phil had his entire education taken care of, so he could just focus on school and not have to work. The same went for his mum. She no longer needed to work like a dog trying to pay for his tuition. This was something he was happiest about. Phil loved his mother, and being able to see her finally take it easy after working hard for so many decades was a relief. If anyone deserved it, then she did. All Phil did was try to help someone who seemed like they were in a bad place. He wasn't doing it because he could be rewarded with something or wanted clout. Phil genuinely wanted to help out Sam and get him some comfort when he had to move around. The fact that it led to all of this was so crazy. Life was truly unexpected. One small action could lead to so many changes in a person's life. It was truly mind-boggling. "Phil?" Emma asked, breaking him out of his thoughts. Is everything okay? You seem a bit distracted. Phil smiled down at her, wrapping his arm a little more tightly around Emma. Yes, I'm fine. I was just thinking about how difficult it's going to be to not see you over the summer. Emma giggled. We'll keep in contact with text, video chat, and phone calls. He knew that they would be able to stay connected that way, but it wasn't the same as being able to wrap his arms around Emma. Seeing her face to face, cuddling with her, and just talking with her was something he was going to miss every single day they were apart. We'll have to visit each other at some point because I know I can't go a whole summer without seeing you. Phil grinned. Same here. I also can't go a whole summer without seeing Sam, so this is even more reason for us to get together. He didn't know what the future held, but he was optimistic that it would work out for not only him, but also Emma and Sam.